Right, good morning everyone, and thank you for all getting up early and coming to this first session, which will be the first of a really packed weekend, as always, at Traquair for Beyond Borders. Really delighted that the first session is focused on history, dear to my heart, and local history at that. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce Murray Pittock, a wonderful professor of history, has talked about the Jacobites here before, but this is the 150th anniversary of John Buchan, and also Geoffrey Baskerville, who many of you will know well from previous years. So I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to hand over to Geoffrey, and we'll get on with the first session. Thank you.
Well, I would just like to echo Catherine's warm welcome, because it is lovely to see you here on a lovely day. A day that Buchan would have liked, walking around these hills and valleys and generally indulging his love of countryside. But he was a lover of many other things as well. I noticed as I came in today, the poster outside describes Beyond Borders as a literary festival. But I think we all know that it's a lot more than that, and that behind the literature there's a great deal of thought about world events, the nature of politics, the nature of how we live. And besides being somebody who wrote entertaining spy fiction, which is what a lot of people know Buchan for, he was a man of great perspicacity and depth of thought, and I hope that ground is what we're going to cover today, or some of it anyway. I think that the fact that he is known for one thing in particular by many people was summed up by his granddaughter in this book. When she was a young girl, she went to a charity event, and there was a bingo event there, and she suddenly heard the bingo caller call out, "All the steps 39." And that seems to be more or less the platform for many people, for a writer who seems to be always in print, but somewhat to the side of appreciation of Scottish writing. Murray, how would you interpret Buchan's position in our contemporary culture?
Well, I think one of the reasons for having this conversation, and indeed for looking at Buchan afresh in his 150th anniversary, is because he is to the side. Ursula Buchan, his granddaughter, called her recent biography Beyond the 39 Steps. And the effort to get beyond the 39 steps is a persistent one with Buchan, and is most unfair, because Buchan's reputation is very largely mediated through Hitchcock's 1935 film. As you say, on the literary side, a lot of the literature is actually in print, people are reading it, but when it comes to studying, writing, talking about Buchan, there's a reluctance to do so because of his perceived, in a Scottish context, his perceived political position as a Tory, an imperialist, and various other things that get you, and have got you for some considerable time, cancelled in the Scottish literary canon. So I think those are the key problems we face with Buchan today. He remains famous, but beyond that book, no one's quite sure for what. And I think one of the purposes of this conversation is to tease out some of the other things that are really important about Buchan's thought and imaginary.
Well, can we start by thinking about, you've marginalising it, is he a Scottish writer? Because he spent a lot of time in leisure terms coming back to his country of origin, but most of his life out of it in terms of his professional career. Is he a Scottish writer?
Most definitely, Buchan as a Scottish writer is, as one of the interesting things about his childhood is, as his sister Anna Buchan writes, they were brought up with a virulent dislike of the English, and when they had an English cousin visit, they kept on looking when they were children, about 7 or 8, for the cousin's tail. Most unfortunate for the girl in question. And Anna was so frightened she went to sleep in John's room because she didn't want to share the room with her English cousin because she might commit all kinds of injustices on her. And when the first time that Buchan actually visited England, it was to visit the site of Flodden. So not only that, but he was committed to the Scottish countryside. He almost died as a young climber on Buccleuch Moor in 1898, and by 1905 he'd climbed all just over 24 peaks of the Black Cuillins, including Scot. So he was dedicated to the Scottish landscape, to Scotland's history and culture, and was a Scot. And if I were to take a quotation which comes right at the end of his life, because sometimes it's one of the things, Scotland appears in different guises in Buchan. It appears as Canada, it appears as Israel. He writes he writes at the end of his life in Sickheart River that he had come to leave an alien civilization and worship at the altar of the Northern Wilds. And that worship at the altar of the Northern Wilds is both something that's core to Buchan's identity, his imagination, and also his personal sense of purpose, and indeed his existential, what you might call the existential Buchan, the Buchan who's unsure about who we are and how we can be secure, which are really fundamental concerns for all of us in the world.
Well, it seems to me that there are quite deep themes running through so much of Buchan's writing, which are in many ways disguised by these other sort of surfaces that run along, whether it's spy fiction or whether it's historical fiction or whatever else. And of course, he wrote in other forms as well. So, I mean, what kind of themes are we looking at? I mean, one that strikes me in our contemporary moment is the idea of the deep state. Beyond the spy fiction moment, there is a deep state paranoia almost running through some of his writing.
Absolutely. So Buchan probably pioneered in The Powerhouse in 1916 the idea of the deep state, about things happening beyond all democratic process and beyond all democratic institutions. And he was also concerned about the way in which, and this comes through very much in the political writing in the 30s, the rise of authoritarianism, and his anxiety about democracy was that the new means of communication, he was thinking of mass media rather than social media, obviously, but the new means of communication were helping to break apart what he regarded as essential to a democratic decision-making process. That is the presence of an informed electorate, or an electorate willing and interested to be informed. And he saw that as part of the issue over what he called a kind of, very memorably, a kind of nursery Caesarism, the desire to be lulled into a sense of security and pacified by the illusion of a great man, which is how he identified authoritarianism in the 1930s. This political writing in this context is extremely redolent of the world we live in today.
Well, it goes beyond, I mean, there's a quotation here which touches exactly from the 39 steps on what you were saying. Away behind all governments, there's a big subterranean movement going on, engineered by very dangerous people. But that's amplified in a book like Prince of the Captivity, where he goes much, much more deeply into the way in which international politics might possibly be working.
He does, and I think the Iron Hands in the Prince of the Captivity, which was published in 1933 but largely written in 1931, are the Nazis, no question about it. And one of the interesting things about Buchan is he describes Nazism very, very early in the 1930s, right before they're elected, before Hitler becomes Chancellor in 1933, as the politics of the gutter. He is. There's no question. Prince of the Captivity is not a great book, because there's the discussions about politics and the international situation in the late 20s and early 30s, in the middle of the book, go on rather a long time. But one of the interesting things about it is one of Buchan's outstanding Zionist works of fiction, and I'm going to hopefully explain that in a little bit more context later on. But in the sense that it puts together MacAndrew, who is in fact Mayer, the German Jew who is the spy master of Adam the hero in World War I, and Adam's sacrifice for the Jews to save the Jews from the Iron Hands at the end of the book. So that in World War I, the Jew sacrifices his life for the Scot. In World War II, the Scot sacrifices or the beginning, run up to World War II, the Scot sacrifices his life for the Jew. And the kinship between Scotland and Israel is a very important, or Judaism is and the Jewish race is a very important part of Buchan's thinking and his imagination. And Prince of the Captivity brings that out as a novel more than any other piece of his fiction.
Well, it's precisely focused in that name, isn't it, MacAndrew?
It is. Exactly.
Yeah.
MacAndrew Mayor, yes. Yeah.
I mean, the amount of thought that he put into debating political situations or political procedures comes out in a number of works. So I was thinking particularly Lodge in the Wilderness, which is almost like a sort of Platonic discussion, dialogue, set in relating to his time in South Africa when he found a place that was central to his thinking, somewhere where you could go and retreat and think about who you are and what you're doing. And that comes out very politically in The Lodge in the Wilderness.
Yes, so the background here is that Buchan, seen as a very promising young man, one of these compellingly clever individuals, even in his early 20s, was taken effectively to run the civil administration or parts of the civil administration of South Africa. First of all as Lord Milner's private secretary, but then as effectively a commissioner of part of the South African territories in the wake of the Boer War. And that drove a lot of his thinking, because he didn't like the outcome of the Boer War, and he also developed thinking round about the long-term possibilities of black majority rule, which reflected in his novel Prester John in 1910, and also about the importance of saving big game from poachers, because he became an early advocate of game reserves in the Transvaal and elsewhere in 1903. But A Lodge in the Wilderness, which he published in 1907, is a really odd book which almost nobody looks at now, because it's a work of fiction, except it's not really a work of fiction. It is, as you say, Jeff, a Platonic dialogue. And it's a Platonic dialogue where basically people are different people round the table, some analogous or actually real life people, some not so, are putting forward an imperial a view about the British Empire and how it should develop. And the core battle is between those who see it as a centralized entity and those who see it as an entity which is in the long-term process of dissolution. And there are all kinds of debates about that in Lodge in the Wilderness. Buchan is very interested in the idea of imperial federation, but he doesn't think it can all happen at once. However, his position is a gradualist position towards the development of imperial federation, and that starts to come through in The Lodge in the Wilderness and develops much later. So he wants to see, just to put the historical context here, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland then as an independent dominion became independent states fundamentally in the 1920s, 1925 to 27. And Buchan supported India becoming an independent state in the immediate wake of that, and he also supported the development of independence movements within a British Commonwealth structure for a wide variety of other states moving slowly from that point. So the position in Lodge in the Wilderness is a debate really about finding a way between two different kinds of ideals. The idea of the jingoistic League of Empire loyalists, we were great and foreigners are awful British Empire, because Buchan dislikes jingoism very much. And the idea of British Empire, which is in the process of its own dissolution, and the question is the pace of that process. And Buchan ends up in the middle of that debate. But there's although it's very much policy Platonic reading, it is a matter of the debates of the time. There are some very striking passages in it, as when one of the characters reflects some of Buchan's views by saying, "Why shouldn't the Nigerians resent and reject us because we destroyed their homes and killed their children?" So I think he's very conscious of the injustices of empire, even as he moves in what is perforce, since that's the world in which he makes his career, finishing up as Governor General of Canada in an imperial framework.
I mean, his career is enormously international, and I suppose one would say from the outside quite successful. To end up as the Governor General in Canada, but also to have worked in the political arena as well and be so successful as a writer. And yet, partly what you're saying about this dialogue of ideas, there's a sense, I suspect, in his writing, that he's not happy with any of it. He's not happy with himself.
No.
His sense of self and his sense of Scottishness. There's a sort of duality in that.
So I think so. That's absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons that to read Buchan as a fiction writer, never mind though it's very important, and we will be discussing further his political writing, is that he is the premier, I would suggest, the premier fiction writer of Scottish imperial experience. And that might be one experience one wants to disown or distance oneself from, but nonetheless it was a very important experience for an awful lot of Scots for 200 years. And what he presents there is very much the kind of consciousness that was reflected in the really peculiar instruction that Charles Napier gave his officers in India in the 1850s to, we shall now, gentlemen, be carrying out the typical Anglo-Saxon process of rapine, robbery and murder, which was said, it's very hard to reconstruct the tone of that. But what it shows is something you can find quite often in different respects in Scottish imperial thinking, inside and outside. People who are performing a part, and who are conscious that they're being untrue to a part of themselves in performing that part. And you can probably see it. I mean, I don't want to get too psychoanalytical. Buchan would certainly reproach me for that. But you can probably see it even in the way in which, if you look at those 2 or 3 surviving video clips of Buchan on YouTube, he is very, very clipped. His boyhood speech is very, very suppressed. You know, it's as I was saying in the green room earlier, is a sense of I'm Scottish, but please don't notice it if you can possibly not. That's something that says something about the imperial experience and the alienation. So in Sickart River, the last book he wrote, is about an imperial servant effectively going after an American politician who's decided to rediscover his Quebecois heritage by going back into the wilds of Canada. And Leithen, one of Buchan's roster of heroes, Leithen follows him because he knows he's going to die and he wants to rediscover the altar of the Northern Wilds, Scotland / Canadian wilderness, before he dies. And in the end, he gives his life for a group of Native Americans who are suffering from disease and want. So that sacrifice is, as it were, the atonement, in part, you can see it, for the career as an imperial servant. Or you get a really curious and tremendous work of fiction from a kind of field sports perspective in John McNab, where a group of Scottish politicians working in Westminster go up to Scotland to poach against estates which have been bought by incomers, as a kind of protest against who owns Scotland, even though they are, that includes Leithen as the former Attorney General, and various other figures. And it's also present in an early short story like Fontainebleau, where a man who has spent his life as an imperial servant looks back to the island of his youth, to the avenue of lost hopes and, in a sense, lost years despite his great success. And it's called Fontainebleau in a reference that is very difficult to automatically spot. But the Treaty of Fontainebleau is the treaty of 24th November 1745, by which the French crown pledged its support to James VIII's attempt in the 1745 rising via his son Charles Edward Stuart to recover Scotland and to recover the British crowns for the House of Stuart. So it is, given that Buchan was himself, as a student in Oxford, a neo-Jacobite, or was a diner at the White Rose Club. It's a deliberate effort.
Teased for it.
Yes, I was teased for it, to suggest that he is, or his fictional avatar in Fontainebleau, is a performer of lost hopes, linked to that ultimate performance of lost hopes, the Jacobite Rising of 1745. And that theme, I'm doing something, but is it the right thing, is there throughout Buchan. I just leave it one other way in which it manifests itself, and there are many others, is in a couple of short stories early on. One, the Lemnian, where a man from Lemnos passing the attempt to hold the Persian army by Leonidas at Thermopylae decides in the end, although he hates the Spartans, he's going to join them because the Persians are worse. And which is a metaphor, I think, for the Union in some ways in Buchan's eyes, and also the older loyalty, which is again published about in 1899, which shows a group of Lowland Scots passing a group of Highlanders who've been taken by redcoats, the aftermath of the 45 Rising, and they hear them speaking Gaelic, and when they hear them speaking Gaelic and the redcoats jeering at them, they turn around and attack the redcoats and free the prisoners. So there are lots of this kind of doubleness in Buchan's life. It takes many forms, but it's the performance, the strain of performing, being an imperial servant, set against the nature of Buchan, the passionate Scot.
I mean, the Scotland that he inherits intellectually is very much bound up in that, isn't it, really? That he is very, very conscious of a buried cultural past, or at least an inactive cultural past, and having to go out and, as you say, perform in another context, but dragging it with him as he goes.
So, yes, and I think he doesn't know how to resolve that, and I think he comes, although he's the son of a Free Kirk minister, to blame a significant part of it on Scottish Presbyterianism in line with other Scottish Renaissance writers. So at the end of Witchwood, which is the ultimate anti-Covenant or pro-Montrose novel of where Scotland went wrong in the 1640s, David Semple, the minister, goes to fight on the continent with the words, "All roads are the same that lead for this wayful land." And Buchan feels that Scotland has got into a paradoxical situation regarding its own identity, which can only be addressed by performing on a larger stage. And for him, that larger stage is inevitably the British Empire. But he's very uncomfortable nonetheless, because he sees the Scottish issue as unresolved. And he writes, this is unpublished material from before the First World War, he writes in support of the development of Home Rule for Scotland, leaving aside defence and foreign affairs. But he's very conscious, though he says later on, every man should be man in the old sense, inclusive brackets not inclusive. Every man should be a Scottish nationalist, which of course is not to be taken literally as a modern commitment, but fundamentally what Buchan is worried about in Scottish nationalism, as he sees it in the 30s, is narrowness and parochialism and the reignition of small-scale Scottish internecine conflict, whereas in fact Scotland is bigger than that. Has become a global nation, and it's part of the paradox of Scotland. It's become a global nation, but a global nation it is, and he doesn't want to lose that in any constitutional change for Scotland.
And I was quite struck to read that at the end of or towards the end of his time in Canada, he sort of openly says, Canada's situation is very much like my own. And so he's embodying it out of Scotland, but nonetheless in another country, performing an imperial role.
Exactly. It's half wild and half reformed. I mean, in a sense, when he says a Governor General must stick to Governor Generalities, which is one of his notable quotes from his period, he's giving you a very clear tell of what he's about. My role is Governor General, but my person is not. And he exhibits that person by making no fewer than, I think, 30 speeches to First Nations, Native American tribal groups, accepting honorary chiefdoms, having his official portrait as Governor General of Canada in a chief's headdress, and also giving part of one of those to the Cree in Cree itself. He speaks the language to a small degree. So that is very unusual for a British Governor General in the 1930s, and that's Buchan telling you who he is when he has escaped from Governor Generalities.
I mean, if we go back just a little to his view of Scotland, its independence or potential independence, its constitutional position, how clear is he about his view on that?
Well, he's actually very clear in his unpublished material that he's got, he takes two views. One, that it's important to have a devolved government in Edinburgh to relieve congestion in the Imperial Parliament, which is a traditional Malcolm Rifkind, when he supported devolution, Malcolm Rifkind kind of view. And also he says that it's very important that Scotland will do better if it can do better for itself, and so it needs self-government. He sees self-government as part of the growth of autonomous communities, and in one throughout the empire. And one thing I think Buchan is closer to a correct analysis, and there's a debate here, but I'm going to put this forward, a correct analysis than many of the views of the last 20 or 30 years, which is he sees Scottish nationalism and Scottish self-government as very analogous to New Zealand. He doesn't see it as analogous to Catalonia or to small country European nationalism. He sees it as fundamentally Dominion style in its appropriate satisfaction and its nature, and that's different about him. He's very clear about that. And now it's also said, of course, Buchan is often associated with the Tories, and he occasionally says, I am a Tory. But it's very important to me he sat as a Scottish Unionist MP for the Scottish universities, when the universities had their own constituencies up to 1947, very different kind of thing from a constituency seat. And also remembering that Scottish Unionism, as a political party, is not the modern Conservative Party, though the modern Conservative Party likes to forget it, and so do its opponents. But it included liberal unionists and freestanding unionists who were not affiliated to any party. So although they supported the Union, traditionally Scottish Unionism was very patriotic. Buchan, for example, during his time as a Unionist MP, fronted the appeal for the National Trust for Scotland to buy the site at Bannockburn. He had already supported Scottish National Theatre. He supported developments of the Scottish language. He wrote the preface to Hugh MacDiarmid's Sangshaw. He first identified MacDiarmid's writing in Synthetic Scots. These are not the actions of a modern Tory MP or MSP, usually, but they were Buchan's actions, and they belong to a different tradition. And I think one of the reasons we misunderstand Buchan is we misunderstand the complexity of the debates about the British Empire when he was alive, and also when he's described as a Tory, we have in our minds an image of that particular Tory we do not like at the present moment. There may be more than one. I wouldn't want to. But that isn't reasonable, because Scottish Unionism is a more complex and largely extinct beast.
Right.
I mean, not unionism with a small u, but the principle represented by the Unionist Party.
I mean, running through so much of what he writes and what he does is a hatred of ideology.
Absolutely. So Buchan is very Millite and on liberty, in the sense he's a classic supporter of freedom of speech, and by that he means the right to challenge any opinion and the grounds of evidence of any opinion, and the right to advance an opinion forcefully only depending on your consent to having it challenged. Otherwise, you're just bullying people into accepting it. So he's very clear. He's very clear on that. He's very clear on the importance of a widely informed debate based on the evidence, and he's also very clear about what will undermine it, which he identifies as authoritarianism, state idolatry. There's a universal danger of a kind of state idolatry establishing a tyranny over the human soul. He says in a speech in Montreal in 1937, and also very important for Buchan, the sense that we must be absolutely free as individuals to think as we want and plan as we want, and it's the job of the state to provide the infrastructure that gives us the freedom to think. So he supports, for example, an initiative for developing of affordable and improved housing in the 1930s because that's an infrastructure, but he doesn't support a superstructure of state restriction in any way, shape or form.
And he also sort of puts it in a sort of an inward way as well, doesn't he, to say that a minority must respect a majority, but a majority must also respect the sacred things that belong to a minority, which gets bound up in what you've just said from the actual acting out point of view.
Yes, again, it's very Millite. It's the tyranny of the majority, safeguards against the tyranny of the majority that Mill advanced on liberty. John Stuart Mill advanced on liberty. That's Buchan's teacher here. But when Buchan says that a minority's sacred things must be respected, he is ultimately thinking of the unionist tradition in Scotland he represents, but he's also thinking of the nature of imperial and international policy, that when a majority must get its way, but it cannot get its way at the expense of neglecting a minority's sacred things. And he comes on to this, I think, and I hope we will come on to this in the last few minutes, when he comes to discuss the formation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine in the 1920s and 30s.
This is where we're going, and I think this is the right moment to bring this up. I mean, he was chair of the Cabinet Committee on Palestine. How would you sum up his views on what he thought should happen in Palestine and what should happen for a homeland for Jews?
So he's very strong supporter of from the 1920s onwards of a Jewish homeland, and he's inscribed in the Golden Book of Israel. Weizmann formally marks his passing as a great friend of the Zionist movement. He's on, which is one of the ludicrous things about sometimes people calling Buchan an anti-Semite. He's on the SS death list for Zionist activities by the late 1930s. He's noted and he's noted even earlier than that by the Third Reich as one of their most prominent opponents. So, absolutely, he wants a Jewish homeland, but he has got a problem which he recognizes. So, because he says Palestine is not a museum of antiquities, but a homeland for its present occupants also. And what Buchan writes, does setting up a Jewish national home imply? One thing it does not imply, the setting up of a Jewish national state. To create in favor of the Jews a fresh example of the kind of intolerant nationalist organization found in the rest of the world. But no more does it give any support to an Arab national state. The Zionist ideal, let me repeat, does not depend so much upon the extent of territory upon which a national home may be created, as upon the opportunity which such a home offers for the development of the Jewish genius. So what Buchan wants effectively is, again, the autonomous communities developing towards independence. He wants the current, and he doesn't think the current British Palestine Authority, because he dies, of course, 8 years before the Palestine Authority ends, is up to it. So he's really worried about that. He thinks their constant changing of backing Arab and Jewish interests in the Palestine Mandate is toxic to an ultimate solution. But what he wants to see is fundamentally two autonomous communities in the British Palestine Mandate moving towards greater autonomy. He wants to see a Palestinian homeland and a Jewish homeland within the boundaries of the Palestine Mandate.
Effectively, an envelope to include everything. But he does get a bad rap for being an anti-Semite, because so many of his characters reflect certain contemporary views, which quite often are demolished later on in the book. Is he going to be saddled with this permanently? Why don't we know more about his Palestinian views? Because they're privately expressed?
No, they're not all privately expressed. I mean, I'm quoting here from some from unpublished manuscripts, but he gives speeches at Shoreditch Town Hall, He gives a number of speeches. His work on the Palestine Committee is part of the official parliamentary record. But the thing is, we've separated Buchan, the politician, the global man of affairs, from the guy who writes spy shockers. We've separated it in our heads. And actually, you do need to see the fiction and the man together. I'm not sure. I think the anti-Semitic tag is being successfully pushed back against. It's a bit hard to be inscribed in the Golden Book of Israel and to be thought to dislike the Jews, but people have managed it. However, I think it is retreating. And as you say, what happens to anti-Semitic characters in the books is quite often not very pleasant. For example, the 39 Steps is one of the classic examples where Hanne's overnight guest the last thing he expresses is the Jews are probably behind it all, and the next morning Hanne wakes up to find he's been murdered, and indeed goes on to find out the Jews are not behind it all. So it's not really very much of a ground to understand Buchan on. Buchan allows a lot of debate in the books, and sometimes even a Platonic debate beyond the realm of fiction, as in Lodge in the Wilderness, but he's allowing a debate between views he agrees with and views he doesn't agree with.
Before we open this to questions, I would just like to finish between ourselves on the note about what you've described as the existential Buchan. Buchan in quest of himself, and using particular metaphors and symbols in his writing. The idea of an island, the idea of mountains, the idea of finding oneself, the essential self, in that sort of isolated freedom.
Yeah. So the island for Buchan and interestingly, Alien Barn is the island that is used most frequently, for example, in Prince of the Captivity. It's not the only island. Alien Barn, which is about 2.4 hectares in expanse, is now basically more or less covered with the Karlak Sky Bridge. But so if you see a modern photograph of it, it doesn't look like a place of rural imagination. But interestingly for Buchan, it's parked halfway between Skye and between the Skye and the mainland, which is a classic place for Buchan to place an ideal island. But the island symbolizes a place where, Scotland being full of them, where you can be alone and you can think your own thoughts, and you can be separated from those international pressures that inevitably change and condition the person you are into governor generalities. And likewise, the same is true of the mountain. And Buchan is an almost obsessive mountaineer. He has a huge desire to conquer, even into his early 60s. He's climbing 100-meter high rock faces by the Mackenzie River in Canada. He's got an obsession to conquer the summit, and that really is the man himself. He wants to be able to withdraw into his imagined life, which is where the island comes in, and he wants to be able to conquer everything in front of him, which is where the mountain comes in. And that restlessness, that search for a sense of meaning, which is both intensely personal and also becomes national and international as a writer, as a politician, as a thinker, because, speech in 1939, Buchan says, the next great age will be the age of not of print but of telecommunications, which again is a thing to say in 1939. That quality of doubleness, that goes right to the heart of who Buchan is as a person, and it's much more complicated than being Scottish and British.
Well, can we open this to our audience here? Do we have a microphone? Can I see at the back here? Right, microphones are available, so where shall we start? There's a gentleman there in the middle of this row here.
Hello. Yeah, a bit out of my depth, I think, but anyway, I'll do my best. I read something briefly. Tell me about the Balfour Declaration, and you mentioned he can be accused of being anti-Semitic, but a Zionist. This was the start of the 20th century. The Balfour Declaration was seen as anti-Semitic. To be honest, it was seen because we don't want Jews in the UK, so you got to put them somewhere. Is that correct? Is that? Is that a true? I'm out of my depth here. I don't know the history.
Well, it depends. It depends because the Zionist movement is founded in Vienna in the 1890s, and when it's founded in Vienna, there's a very I think it's in the age. It's in the age of the age of yesterday. I think I'm getting it right. There's a discussion in that book about whether or not a lot of Viennese Jews really laughed at the development of the Zionist movement because they thought it was really silly and they'd much rather be in Vienna, thank you very much. And it became popular initially among people among Jews in the westerly parts of the Russian Empire because their life was not nearly so pleasant. However, things changed in the first half of the 20th century quite markedly. And so, yes, when the initial Balfour Declaration was made, and it's of course partly made in the context of the resolution of World War I and not giving the Saudi royal family what they wanted or expected from T.E. Lawrence's promises, then there were people who did see it in that light, but that was a wasting asset. As the late 1920s and early 1930s came around, it became much more popular because people could see the way in which the world was going. And indeed, although people didn't know about the Holocaust in 1939, one of the extraordinary things in Scot River is when he's almost on his deathbed, Lethen says, I could, smelling the trenches again, smelling the machine guns, and now smelling the incinerators. Which is, again, a comment that he shouldn't have known in 1939, but did. So the answer is yes, but it changes.
There's a lady here.
You referred early in your talk, for which thank you, to his observations about dissemination of information. You referred later to his view on the restraints or constraints of the state. So thinking now about something like the online safety bill and the challenges of the cyber world, what do you, from your expert knowledge of Buchan, think his view might be?
How would Buchan have voted on the online safety bill? So Buchan would certainly have been absolutely horrified at an awful lot of things the online safety bill was designed to protect against. But I think he would have had doubts, because the one thing that is clear about Buchan, which is so very unclear about much modern policy and political decision making, is that people don't think laterally. They don't think about everybody who could be impacted and how they could be impacted. They just think about the problem and the solution. And often the outcome is not what was intended, and often that could be predicted if you were to be prepared to think a little bit laterally, for example, about behavioral change or about people in different categories from the ones you were thinking about to protect. So I don't like to say historical characters would have done X or Y on a particular contemporary issue, but I think he would have understood why people opposed it and would not have wanted to see them demonized as kind of apprentice child molesters. I think demonizing people who oppose a measure, which we started doing at scale during the COVID restrictions, is not helpful. Not everybody who opposes a measure is an extremist who wants to see the whole world turned upside down. But telling them they are is a way to create more extremists. And Buchan would certainly have understood that.
There's a gentleman here.
Thank you very much, Murray. I had a question. One of the novels that Buchan wrote that you didn't talk about was Greenmantle, which I think 1916, World War I. He's professionally engaged in that part of the world during the war at a senior level. He writes this novel which is about spies trying to bring down Ottoman Empire and so on and so forth. To what extent was his professional experience at that time influencing presumably what he wrote? And how was what he wrote influencing him later on his views on how the Middle East should be settled, whether there should be a state of Israel or a land for the Jews and something for the Palestinians as well? Thank you.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and thank you very much for it. It's difficult to resolve ultimately. Obviously, the constant green mantle is that Germany is trying to get the Ottoman Empire to declare a jihad against the Allied powers. And Buchan was very conscious, obviously unsuccessful in doing so. There were a lot of problems with the Ottoman Empire itself. But Buchan was very conscious of that political gambit. He was certainly receiving, and most of the papers are now not there for one reason and another. He was certainly receiving a lot of reports as Director of Information, which was part of his career we didn't get to, but you just got to, in 1917-18. They absolutely formed the basis for his espionage novels. So the modern spy novel descends from somebody who was a spy master. But he's also conscious of the kind of world of Arab politics and the extreme edge of Arab politics and the attempts of Germany to take advantage of that. And so, although we can't be sure, we absolutely can be confident without being sure that it's the reports that he received during that time and his awareness of what was going on in the spy war behind the scenes as the Ottoman Empire faltered that conditioned his viewpoint as well as his fiction. About the Palestine Mandate, there isn't a clear line there, but he's very conscious of Arab rage and indignation in the 1930s, and he's also very conscious that the British authority in Palestine is not sufficiently sensitive to how to diffuse that.
Have we time for one more question? Gentleman here at the back. Sorry.
Thanks for the discussion, gentlemen. Listening to the discourse, just as the previous questioner said something that wasn't mentioned, there's nothing said so far about supranational bodies like the League of Nations. All I was hearing this morning was about a kind of paternalist great power divvy up and solution focused, and it kind of reminded me of, or made me think of superpower negotiations over another country, possibly Ukraine. But did Buchan have any view or any thoughts about the role of supranational bodies which were not imperialist or not power blocks, such as the League of Nations?
He didn't think the League of Nations was effective, and he was right. I mean, and it had showed itself to be absolutely not effective by the time of the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1936. So he's not against the League of Nations. He doesn't think that it's effective. And yes, he is a great power politician, though I don't think you can put that into a 21st century context. We have totally different international order, and the point about the international order is its critics have always said it's dominated by the United States, but now the United States is in the process of deserting it, and that's what's causing so much of the instability in it. But what Buchan does seek to do is to try and get third parties involved. It's a power politics world in the 1920s and 30s. Third parties involved. So perhaps his greatest political attempt, though it does fall short because Chamberlain refuses the advance, and also Roosevelt would have had difficulties in squaring it with an isolationist America, is that he tries to get America on board, and he tries to get Roosevelt to chair the Munich Conference in 1938. There's quite a lot of work about that in terms of Buchan's own diplomatic toing and froing. He thinks it's essential that Roosevelt chairs that conference. Otherwise, he's not content that a deal won't be done which will favour Hitler's interest in the Sudetenland. And he thinks the signal to Hitler, even at one remove, that the United States is involved in European affairs will be critical in restraining him. So he doesn't actually succeed in that, but that's his view. And I think that, that for the time, again, seems an extremely reasonable and rational view. He understands Britain's days as a great power are numbered in 1938, and he knows that Britain can't afford to fight another war and remain an intact imperial power. You may wish that he'd taken other views, but the League of Nations was very ineffective in the interwar era, and Buchan's view fundamentally is, how do we negotiate power politics in a way which involves third parties which make a settlement more likely. He's very keen on third-party guarantors, as he is in Palestine.
Murray, thank you. I think we have to draw a line under it because there are other events to follow this one. But thank you all. Murray, thank you. I'm just going to do a slight promo for this book because in a way I can see there are all sorts of questions. It's very difficult to cram everything there is to say about Buchan into 50 minutes. But Ursula Buchan, his granddaughter, covers a lot of the material that his activities in the First World War, his attitudes to America particularly. She details how he went about courting Roosevelt and Coolidge before him. So if anybody's particularly interested, you'll find the book outside. So that's my advertisement over. And of course, Murray's book as well, which you're going to sign?
Scotland, the Global History.
Yeah.
I'm going to sign it, which will put Buchan in the context of the global Scotland that he's thought of as really important. So I'm going to sign that over in the book tent.
2 books to take home with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will be shortly moving on to our next session, so sit tight if you can for the next 5 minutes and join us again here for A Matter of Conflict.